Good morning, Dan and Amy. What to do in Syria and the continuing back and forth, which is not unusual and not unprecedented in terms of responsibility for the chemical attack in Douma that killed 42 and injured and sickened hundreds more. Bashar Jafari, who is the the Syrian ambassador to the UN, addressed that, suggesting that, of course, the Assad regime was not responsible. This is, conspiracy theory promulgated by the Americans in the West.
I hope you are not naive to pose such a question after all what you have heard from all parts. We denied maybe 1,001 time. Similar to 1,001 nights, the Arabian Nights. We denied 1,001 time using any chemical substances against our own people. And we provided all the necessary and required justifications for saying that. So it's time to digest and metabolize what we are saying.
Do you have any versions on who might have used them?
We said it many times. Of course, the terrorists have acquired chemical substances from Libya a long time ago, from the Libyan stock. But this operation was facilitated by the Turkish intelligence, the Saudi intelligence, and the American and French intelligence services.
Okay, so they did it.
So there's one layer of spin from the Syrians. Mattis was before. Mad Dog Mattis, Secretary of Defense, before the House Armed Services Committee yesterday talking about the prospect of a Syrian strike. Since the president tweeted about it, Congress became very interested in it.
It's a point of contention with some. It sounded like not if, but when we're going to strike, according to that tweet.
Yeah, understandable. Here's what Jim Mattis had to say about both the tactical and strategic concerns he has with the reality on the ground in Syria at present.
Well, there's a tactical concern, ma'am, that innocent people, we don't add any civilian deaths and do everything humanly possible to avoid that. We're trying to stop the murder of innocent people. But on a strategic level, it's how do we keep this from escalating out of control, if you get my drift on that.
Let's see if our friend Jim Carafano gets Secretary Mattis's drift. We're pleased to be joined to discuss these topics by Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano, U.S. Army veteran, author of Surviving the End and Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World, also the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thanks for joining us and appreciate it.
Hey, good to be with you.
So what about, let's start with Mattis and worried about the situation in Syria escalating if you get his drift. What is his drift?
Well, look, you never take the use of coercive force lightly. Mattis is a guy who spent his whole life in the trenches and understands that, and so you never walk blindly into these things. And I think that's the kind of advice and sober reflection we expect from our military advisors. I think the likelihood of escalation here is kind of limited because the Russians and Syrians and Iranians are all fighting together, but they all have very different objectives. I mean, the Russians don't want to see this thing spin out of control. The Russians already have what they want. They have the ports, gives them access to the Mediterranean. Assad's firmly established. They have an ally. They have a bloc to keep ISIS from coming into Russia. They have a lot of business dealings in Damascus. Those are secure. So the Russians are the happy power. Assad wants all his territory back. And, honestly, the Russians, Iranians are happy to fight to the last Syrian. But, there's nothing in it for the Russians to take that last square inch of territory. And Iran wants a strategic superhighway that runs up to the Israeli border so they can threaten the Israelis. That's good for the Iranians, but that doesn't do anything for the Russians. So I don't see what's in it for the Russians to see this thing spiral out of control.
Well, what's in it for us? I mean, clearly something needs to be done. Last time we struck a pretty much an empty airfield in Syria. If we do something, what are we targeting?
So if we go back and review the history, last time after we did the strike, basically we said, look, The unrestrained use of chemical weapons is not helpful. It escalates the conflict. It puts more refugees on the road, and it interferes with our mission, which is what we're trying to do is to crush ISIS. And the regime pretty much stayed out of the way for almost a year until we really finished that mission. And then what happened is the Assad regime was looking for an opportunity to essentially expand their territorial control. So if you remember that the convoy that came down and was attacked by U.S. forces, which killed not only Syrian military, but we also believe Russian mercenaries or contractors. And then this latest round of chemical attacks. And I think what the United States would be justified in doing again is doing a strike to send a signal. Hey, we're trying to accomplish our objectives here, and winding the war up and expanding refugees is not helpful. So look, we don't care about Syria per se. I mean, the Assad family's been our enemy forever. It doesn't really matter. What we don't want to leave conditions in Syria where ISIS comes rolling back and we have another caliphate, where Israel and Iran wind up bumping against each other and having a war, where the problems of Syria spill over into Iraq and Jordan, or where we have masses of refugees on the road like we did 2 years ago, which are putting pressure on the nearby states and dumping into Western Europe and destabilizing Western Europe.
Is there any question in your mind that the Assad regime directed that chemical attack respond to Bashar Jafari's response to the U.S.?
Right. Well, I found his response pretty fatuous, but I'm not access to classified intelligence. So, we just have to kind of do an Occam's razor thing here. It's just, the regime's done this before. Two, it's not difficult for them to get access to this kind of a chemical weapon. Three, they're in control in this region, and they are the responsible party regardless. Four, I mean, we have critical medical reports that people were actually injured by chemical weapons, including blood analysis, which suggests that. So from just looking at the available evidence from the outside, it's highly credible. And the other thing which you have to take into account is the more the Russians and the Syrians ramp up a disinformation and denial campaign, frankly, the more guilty it makes them look.
Yeah. I want to switch gears and talk about Mike Pompeo. He was before the Senate yesterday for his confirmation hearing for Secretary of State. What's your assessment of his the job performance to this point, as CIA director, and the prospects of Secretary of State Pompeo?
I've heard zero criticism, serious criticism of his time at the CIA. People inside the CIA actually thought it was a breath of fresh air in terms of management direction. Much less politicized intelligence coming up to the White House. Much less political correctness in the conduct of CIA operations. So I think people were generally pleased with his tenure at CIA.
Couldn't wait to get rid of Brennan, huh?
He's got a good resume. I think the hearing went fine. I think it's extremely likely that he'll get confirmed.
Okay. Back to Syria real quick. There's one more question I wanted to ask. Besides the chemical weapons that are being dropped, how many hospitals have been bombed, and is there any way to get the UN to try and stop that from happening?
Well, I think it's very difficult to establish some kind of safe zone. I mean, the problem is everybody has what they need. In other words, everybody's core interests are really not threatened here. On the other hand, when any side tries to press its control, it winds up bumping into somebody. And we've seen this over and over again in the last few months. So they expand and they bump into Turkey, and then the Iranians push and they bump into the Israelis, and the Israelis do an attack on the Iranians. It's very, very difficult to see how anybody really expands their interests without creating a larger conflict. And it's very difficult to see that we're on the seams of that conflict. You can have any kind of protection from the UN or anything else. We've had ceasefires before and everything else. Nothing really. The only thing that's going to work is essentially what the U.S. is arguing here, which is through coercion and diplomacy and our other activities, trying to convince people to just kind of cool it and de-escalate the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to create safe zones when you have a regime that is dropping barrel bombs on the civilian population.
Absolutely. And what we really just need is a cold. Look, I'm not sure there's an answer. I mean, I don't think there's a good answer here, right? But a cold peace where everybody's just kind of frozen in place with what they have is it's not a good answer, but it's a better answer than a bad answer.
He is Colonel Jim Carafano, U.S. Army vet, author of Surviving the End, as well as Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World, Foreign Policy Studies Director at the Heritage Foundation. Also, if you want to catch Jim's musings on a even broader range of topics at upstream-ideas.com and our Against the Current series. I've sat down to do a couple of interviews with Jim over the last couple of years, always very insightful and informative. Jim, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Roger. Dad, thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.